The man who produces while others dispose of his product is a slave. If I only had 13 words to express why I'm in favor of strong intellectual property laws, the laws that allow creators to control the use of what they have created, I just simply leave you with these 13 words from Ayn Rand. And when I say intellectual property, I mean every area of law that is comprised under that umbrella term, so in copyright, trademarks, and patents. Ayn Rand wrote those 13 words in 1963 in her work, Man's Rights. Honestly, I couldn't say it any better. The man who produces while others dispose of his product is a slave. Indeed, if someone other than the writer has a right to decide whether or not a university professor can make free copies of the writer's book and distribute these copies to the students, that writer is a slave. There's nothing to do with students, there's nothing to do with education. It's a matter of principle. And if someone other than the writer has a right to decide whether or not the writer's property can be taken away from him, then the writer has no property. Because the same principle can be used to take that property away from the writer in any other case, when somebody else feels like it. When what you create can be taken away from you, without your consent, you're a slave. And without property rights, your right to life is fiction. If you see nothing wrong with a judge deciding that it's okay for you to download counterfeit copies of software simply because you're not uploading it further, you've just agreed to enslave a company that spent millions of dollars and years to develop that code, to write the code. And this has nothing to do with whether software should be free and open source. This has everything to do with usurpation of the right to decide what software should cost by those who did not create it. A football team, Washington Redskins, had been building its brand awareness for its logo 45 years. Then comes Comrade Obama, influenced by political correctness mafia and left-wing media mob, and says that if it was up to him, he'd think of changing the name. And conveniently, US Trademark's office cancels their Redskins trademark registration. How's that for property rights? That's Soviet Union by the book. And I'll tell you more about Soviet Union in a little while. But I think that if you think that this debate is limited to intellectual property, you're not really seeing the big picture. So if a bunch of politicians can order that a subset of patent owners should lose their property for no reason other than they have the audacity to try to enforce it against infringers, don't be mistaken. It's not about protecting legitimate businesses from what they call patent trolls. This is about enslaving inventors and those who invest in their inventions. Elon Musk may gift his patents to the masses all he wants. These were his patents to begin with. And if he feels that giving them away is the best way to attain his goals and attain the goals of his company, this is great. But the crucial point here is that it was his decision. It was his decision he made. And one man's charity does not justify the robbery of everyone else. So trust me, I love free stuff as much as the next guy. But I despise forced redistribution of wealth and property. And I know a little bit about forced redistribution of wealth. You may hear it in my accent when I talk. I come from the capital of forced redistribution of wealth. My people invented it. And to put things into perspective, and to give you some context, since I have some time with you today, and thank you to Karen, where's Karen? Thank you to Karen and Constitutional Foundation for having me here, for inviting me over. I thought it might fascinate you a little bit to hear a story of a guy who was born in Russia, who argued a case one level down from the Supreme Court of Russia when he was still a law student. A story of a PhD in law and a top 5 intellectual property lawyer in Russia who was months away from becoming the partner with Baker McKenzie, the biggest international law firm in the world, when he suddenly decided to move to North America. Why does a guy like that leave? I'll tell you why. He's being exposed to the Western way of life I caught the virus, the freedom virus. And I'd like to share with you what it was like to make that journey across the continent, across the ocean, across a language, across the law degree and into a new law degree. You may be curious to know why it is that I was willing to give up being a hotshot lawyer in Russia to start off as a nobody in Canada. And I'm certainly hoping that if you hear this story, it will deepen even your love for the country that most of you were lucky to be born into. Would it be okay if I spend a couple of moments to share my story? Thank you. So I became an intellectual property lawyer 20 years ago when my father, a famous Russian composer, caught a radio station stealing his music and using it in the commercial for Samsung without his permission. I was then attending my second year of law school, and there's 5 years in Russia. And honestly, I totally didn't see myself as a lawyer, but I've always admired my dad, and I've always tried to please him and always tried to get his approval. So when he asked me if I could help him take this matter to court, what do you think I told him? Yeah, there were only 3 problems with that. I had no idea what copyright law was. I had no idea what to do in a courtroom. And the worst thing, there was no Google to help me figure this out. Long story short, after taking this very first case from the bottom court all the way up to one instance short of Supreme Court of Russia, I won this case for him. At the pinnacle of my Russian career, while I was with Baker McKenzie, I became the go-to lawyer for many multi-billion-dollar companies for everything that had to do with copyright and domain names in Russia. To drop a couple of names, I've done work for Apple, Microsoft, DreamWorks, J.K. Rowling, Ford, and many, 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 many others. However, one very important thing was missing, and that is freedom. Throughout its long history, Russia never had that which separates a truly free country from a country of slaves and masters, and that is the respect for individual rights. Curiously, today's Russia, in many aspects, is closer to a free market economy than Canada or the US. But that is only until the government chooses to take it all away from you, and then you're done. Since my very first visit to the US when I was 13, I've wanted to live in the West. And 8.5 years ago, I gathered my courage and decided to live my dream and start everything from scratch and move to Canada. So my legal career in Canada evolved from having to go back to school, to law school for the full 3 years, getting licensed as a Canadian lawyer, failing to find employment as a lawyer, and starting my own firm. As I was building it, I came up with the idea of Trademark Factory, basically the idea that is today revolutionizing the trademarking industry. Today I run the only firm in the world that provides trademarking services with a free comprehensive trademark search for a single all-inclusive flat fee with a 100% money-back guarantee. So lawyers would appreciate the 100% money-back guarantee on a service that doesn't fully depend on us. As I was building my business, I realized that I was still not enjoying the freedom. I was still missing it. The freedom to help my clients the way they want to be helped, not the way some law society bureaucrat deems it proper for my clients to receive trademarking services. So last year, I chose to voluntarily give up something that I spent years trying to get, my lawyer license. And from an intellectual property lawyer who understands and values entrepreneurship, I became an entrepreneur with deep knowledge of intellectual property. This was a huge leap out of my comfort zone and a very rewarding transformation in my life. My passion for intellectual property was ignited by my father's struggle to protect his music from being stolen. My passion for freedom and individual rights comes from realization that power-hungry Western leaders, together with millions of useful idiots, for decades have been trying to recreate the socialist nightmare from which I thought I was fleeing. And it is these 2 passions that have formed my view on intellectual property that I'm about to share with you. But before we can have a discussion about whether or not we should have IP laws or patent laws, and if yes, how far these laws should go, and what they should do, we need to go back to the basics and analyze the reasons for having laws that protect intellectual property in the first place. There are only 2 such reasons. and these reasons are mutually exclusive. The first reason is to allow people who have created something that had not existed before to treat the fruits of their talent, their passion, their work, their creativity, their vision, their risk-taking, and as their property, and not to have it stolen from them. Under this paradigm, whether such protection benefits so-called society as a whole is irrelevant. The protected rights are valuable per se. Same way we criminalize rape, not because absence of rapes benefits the society as a whole, but because rape violates the natural right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Granted, it does happen to benefit all normal men to know that their mothers, wives, and daughters are not going to be raped while they go for a walk in the park. But laws against rape would still be proper even if men didn't care about their mothers, wives, and daughters, or even if the majority of men actually prefer to rape women with impunity. Laws against rape protect life, liberty, and security of potential victims of rape. Same way, under this first paradigm, intellectual property laws protect the property of creators and those who invest in what creators create. The other collectivist view on IP is that intellectual property only exists insofar as those laws benefit the public. And under this latter paradigm, the so-called society apparently has a right to use whatever cultural legacy it gets its hands upon, unless the government says you should get a permission from the intellectual property owner for that. For collectivists, the only purpose of intellectual property laws is to provide the most benefit to the public by granting certain rights to creators and thereby supposedly encouraging creativity. Philosophically, this approach towards creators is no different from when a slave owner gives his slaves just enough food so that the slave continues to be useful to the master. Collectivists know that one cannot distribute that which had not been created. But their solution is to focus on distribution. They use those without whom there'd be nothing to distribute as molding claim to build their totalitarian utopia. It's not a coincidence that among the first decrees issued by Bolsheviks in Russia, right just when they were slaughtering the Tsar family, one abolished patents and copyrights, and another one criminalized failure to work in a manner that in the state's opinion, was useful to the society. Vladimir Lenin personally wrote and called for randomly killing those who did not work. You think it's a coincidence? Even though Soviet communism is over, the legacy of communism is not. The evil principle behind communism, socialism, and other forms of collectivism is that interests of the so-called society take priority over interests of each particular individual. By definition, collectivism requires that there is someone, usually a small group, who defines what it is in the best interest of the so-called society, which leads to squashing everyone who is not contributing their fair share. This is how collectivism invariably ends up with concentration camps and millions of people slaughtered in the name of the common good. I was born and lived most of my life in the country that killed tens of millions of its own citizens under this evil slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Evil because forced redistribution of wealth always comes at the expense of enslaving both those who received unearned benefits and those who are expected to provide them. As Frederick Bastiat wrote, the government is a great fiction through which everybody endeavors to live at the expense of everyone else. Now back to the issue of intellectual property. Historically, these two paradigms, one protecting interests of creators, regardless of whether they benefit the public, and the one that protects only insofar as it benefits the public, they have often been intermixed with advocates of one approach masking their ideas behind those of their opponents. Instead of openly stating that the interests of the public should be utterly irrelevant, proponents of the natural property rights approach would convincingly demonstrate that providing the broadest scope of protection to creators ends up benefiting the public. And instead of openly stating that creators should only be allowed to exist if they, as Bernard Shaw eloquently put it, could justify their existence by pulling their weight in the social boat. Proponents of the common good approach would misnomer the privileges dispensed by the state to creators as property or rights, knowing full well that nothing that requires somebody else's permission is a right or property. This duality has led to numerous compromises and the absurd idea that we call today the balance of interests. Ayn Rand called it a compromise between a property owner and a burglar. I call it a balance between the interests of rapists and their victims. Neither is possible. The idea that the ultimate goal of intellectual property laws is to strike the perfect balance between the interests of creators and the public is ludicrous. The idea that intellectual property laws are only needed as long as the public benefits from them is evil. In answering the question whether we need patents and intellectual property laws, I refuse to take into account whether such laws create any benefits for those who had not created or financed that what intellectual property laws are supposed to protect. I've heard it all before. A great many fascinating pieces of art have been created by slaves. Myriads of amazing inventions were created at a time when no patents existed. Johann Sebastian Bach wrote the best music known to the humankind without the benefit of having the right to control reproduction of his manuscripts. I get it. Soviet copyright system was reduced to recognizing the right of the author to receive fair remuneration for the first use of the work. The amount of such remuneration was, of course, determined by the state. And then the author retained no rights to control the use of the work. Yet, Soviet authors, and my father among them, continued to create brilliant works of art. And many of them felt quite good about being on the dole of the government. At least the slaves who built the pyramids, is it pyramids or pyramids? Pyramids, thank you. They knew that there were slaves. At least the architects of Russia's most famous cathedral knew that there were slaves when Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible ordered to gouge out their eyes and cut off their tongues in order to make sure that they wouldn't replicate the beauty of his cathedral. Many didn't realize that they were slaves. And as Goethe wrote, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe that they are free. Again, it's not about whether authors and inventors would continue to create. They would. It's about whether we look at them as individuals or as resources. Whether we recognize that they are free or if we treat them as slaves. Yes, if we further limited the degree of control that authors and inventors can exercise over their works and inventions, it is unlikely that we would face a rebellion of people who would suddenly refuse to create. They create because they can, because they're good at it, because they love it. This is the internal struggle that was so brilliantly demonstrated in Atlas Shrugged. But for us to abuse creators' love for what they do is immoral, even if we can easily get away with that. And don't tell me about promoting the progress of science and useful arts language used in the US Constitution and the origins of Statute of Anne, which for the first time established copyright for the book publishers. We're not debating what the law was. We're not debating what the law is. We're debating what the law should be. And just because we have a set of laws as it is today, doesn't mean that it should not evolve. Only my opponents would like to castrate intellectual property. Well, I would want to see it get stronger. Another argument I hear all the time is that people get away with patenting obvious things. Yes, they do. And yes, it's a bad thing. But the solution is to improve methodology for examining and disputing patents. It shouldn't take 4 to 5 years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars for a business to get a patent. Not all patents should last for 20 years. We live in the information age, yet we're still using 19th century technology that relies on a patent examiner's ability to properly identify all prior art in order to figure out if an invention is patentable. But what really infuriates me is the argument that intellectual property laws limit the rights of consumers to use their property. such as computers. The argument goes like this. Someone has bought a computer, and if not for the artificial limitations imposed by the government in the form of intellectual property laws, they would be able to install whatever software, listen to whatever music, watch whatever movies on their computers without having to pay anyone. They see intellectual property as unlawful intervention by the government in the economy. That seems to be the only intervention by the government in the economy that they seem to be against. And the first time I heard this argument here in Canada, I thought to myself, они что, совсем охуели? Which, if translated into English, would sound something like, are you out of your minds? First of all, regardless of what the Supreme Court of Canada found in several of its latest judgments on copyright, despite what anyone else would have you believe, there is no such thing as the right of the public to use other people's works. There is no such thing as a right to a song that you didn't create. Just because you bought a car doesn't mean that you're entitled to free gas. Just because you bought a spoon doesn't mean you're entitled to a free quinoa salad. Just because you were born in the form of a human being doesn't entitle you to use somebody else's music. When you're told that you can't get free gas, food, or music, your rights are not being violated. And I would like to conclude with this. Just look around you. Everything that surrounds us is a result of someone's creative mind. The clothes you wear, this building, the plane that took me from Vancouver to Toronto, the car that got me from the airport to the hotel, this microphone, the internet, the computer, the software, this, everything, the cereal you've had for breakfast, espresso machines, I can go on and on and on and on. All of this would not have existed if it hadn't been created by someone. And I don't mean manual labor. I mean created in someone's brilliant mind. Even if that brilliant mind was standing on the shoulder of somebody else. Imagine your life without all of this. You may be the biggest fan of the Green Party and the biggest supporter of the environment. I'll tell you one thing. Living in a cave sucks. We must be forever grateful to all the people who have contributed to making our lives better and continue to contribute to make our lives better. And the least we can do for them is not to assume that they are our slaves and that the only purpose of their lives is to make our lives better. The least we can do for them is to say thank you to them, is not to steal from them. And our intellectual property laws are a way of expressing our gratitude, not by creating artificial new rights, but by recognizing the rights that are inherently owned by those who create that which had not existed before. It's the only moral way. Thank you.